It began with dust. Thick, red, Texas dust, clinging to the skin like regret. And in the middle of that dust, in the summer of 1950, a young woman named Dorothy Langston vanished without a trace. She was 23 years old, bright, kind, quiet, the sort of woman neighbors described as pure-hearted. She worked nights at the Wheeler textile mill just outside Abilene, saving money to move west and start a new life. On June 14, 1950, she clocked out at 11:07 p.m. The foreman remembered her smile. She always said good night to everyone before leaving. She got into her dark blue 1947 Ford Coupe, waved once to the security guard, and drove toward the main road. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Welcome to Uncommon Stories. If this story stays with you, hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and when the truth found you. Now let's begin. By sunrise, Dorothy's mother, Evelyn Langston, knew something was wrong. Dorothy never stayed out late. She didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't run with boys. Evelyn waited by the window all night, and when the sun came up, the chair she'd been sitting in felt cold. She called the sheriff's office in Taylor County just after 7 a.m. Deputy Charles Dugan took the report himself. He thought maybe Dorothy had eloped. Maybe she'd gone to Dallas to start over. But Evelyn knew her daughter. She wasn't running away. She was missing. They found no skid marks, no sign of her car along the highways. The road from the mill to her home in Sweetwater was a flat stretch of dirt and farmland. Nothing but open land and barbed wire. The kind of place where a person could vanish, and the wind would erase the evidence by morning. 3 days later, her handbag was found by a farmer plowing his field. Inside were her lipstick, her paycheck stub, and a folded church bulletin. Her car keys were gone. And that was all. The sheriff organized a search that spanned 4 counties. Men on horseback combed through dry riverbeds. Police planes flew over abandoned wells, and neighbors scoured barns and sheds for any sign of the missing girl. But the days passed. Then weeks. Then months. By autumn, people had stopped asking. Still, the Langstons never gave up. Every year on June 14th, Evelyn lit a candle by the window. She never moved out of that house. Never changed her number, just in case Dorothy ever called home. But she never did. For 75 years, the case remained cold, one of the oldest unsolved disappearances in Texas history. Dorothy became a ghost in the archives. Her photo, black and white, with that soft 1950s curl in her hair, stared out from missing person posters that had long since yellowed with age. Until this year. It was late spring when a construction crew began clearing the old Buckner Ranch, a dusty 400-acre property that had been abandoned since the 1960s. The plan was to build a series of retirement cabins. The land was rough, overgrown with mesquite and tumbleweed, but the soil was dry, perfect for foundations. On the morning of April 4th, one of the operators, a man named Troy Ellis, was digging a trench for the water line. His backhoe hit something solid about 9 feet deep. At first, he thought it was a boulder, but when the blade scraped across metal, he realized it wasn't rock. It was steel, curved, smooth, a shape too deliberate to be natural. Troy jumped down from the cab and brushed the dirt away with his hands. Beneath the packed red clay, a patch of dark blue paint appeared, chipped but unmistakable. They called the foreman, then the sheriff, and within hours, the site was swarming with investigators. What they uncovered next would send chills through everyone who remembered Dorothy Langston's name. When the dust cleared, it was confirmed. It was a 1947 Ford Coupe, the same model Dorothy had been driving the night she disappeared, perfectly preserved under layers of soil, as if the earth itself had been hiding her all these years. But there was something strange. The car wasn't wrecked. It wasn't rusted through or twisted from impact. It had been deliberately buried, clean, careful, and deep. And when investigators pried open the door, the stale air that escaped carried a scent of decay and gasoline. Inside, still buckled in the driver's seat, sat the mummified remains of a woman. The press called it a miracle find. And for the Langston family, a tragedy finally uncovered. But as a medical examiner began to study the remains, the story that surfaced didn't match the one everyone had believed for 75 years. There were no signs of a crash, no blunt trauma, no broken bones. Dorothy hadn't died in an accident. She'd been placed there, and when investigators examined the passenger seat, they found something else. A small purse, faded but intact. Inside, folded neatly beneath the driver's license, was a handwritten note. It was dated June 13th, 1950, one day before Dorothy vanished. And it read, "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." When news of the discovery broke, Abilene was stunned. People gathered outside diners and hardware stores, whispering her name again after nearly a lifetime of silence. Dorothy Langston. Old men who had once been boys when she vanished stood in disbelief, some swearing they remembered the posters, others recalling their fathers searching the fields for a car. But the longer the story stayed on the evening news, the more uncomfortable the town became, because for the first time in 75 years, they had to face a truth they'd all quietly buried. Someone in that town had known what happened to her all along. The Taylor County Sheriff's Office reopened the case, dusting off yellow files and brittle photographs. In the evidence box, her mother's original handwritten letter still sat, the one begging them to please find my daughter. Beside it, the original map of the 1950 search area, circles drawn in fading red ink. None of them had gone anywhere near the Buckner Ranch. Why? Because back then, that land was owned by a man the locals didn't question. Samuel Buckner, one of the wealthiest cattlemen in West Texas. And no deputy in 1950 was brave enough to go digging on his property. The new sheriff, Rebecca Dugan, the granddaughter of the same deputy who'd first handled Dorothy's case, couldn't ignore the irony. She'd grown up hearing her grandfather's guilt about the one girl he couldn't bring home. Now, she was standing on that same land, staring at the unearthed Ford Coupe that had been hiding under it all along. The car had been buried exactly 9 feet deep, perfectly aligned parallel to an old service road that hadn't existed until years after Dorothy vanished. Whoever buried it had access to heavy equipment, something most farmers didn't own in 1950. As investigators cataloged every inch of the car, the mystery deepened. The note found in the purse was authenticated by handwriting experts. It was indeed Dorothy's. But the real question was who she was writing about. The line, "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident," wasn't the kind of thing an ordinary woman in 1950 would write lightly. Her cousin, Ruth Meyer, now 92 years old, still living in Abilene, agreed to speak with local reporters. Her hands trembled as she held a black and white photo of Dorothy in her Sunday dress, a soft smile and cautious eyes. Ruth said something no one had ever recorded before. "Dorothy told me she was scared of someone, but she wouldn't say who. She said he had connections. I thought she was talking about a boyfriend, but maybe I was wrong." In 1950, Dorothy had briefly dated Thomas "Tommy" Heller, a mechanic known around town for his quick temper and his friendship with wealthy ranchers, including the Buckner family. According to records, he'd worked on Samuel Buckner's trucks that same spring. When Dorothy went missing, Tommy was questioned once, casually, then cleared. He claimed he hadn't seen her in weeks. 2 months later, he left Texas for Louisiana, and by the time the sheriff wanted to follow up, Tommy was gone, along with every trace of the Ford Coupe. The modern-day forensic team combed to the buried car inch by inch. They found no tire damage, no engine failure, no sign Dorothy had driven into the earth. The coupe had been drained of fuel, then lowered carefully into the pit before being covered. The soil layers told a story, one of intention. This wasn't a panic burial. It was planned, and whoever did it had time, machinery, and the kind of isolation that only a ranch that large could offer. The Buckner Ranch itself had a dark history. Locals remembered stories of missing livestock, mysterious fires, and workers who came and went without warning. Some whisper about a barn that burned down one winter, and how the sheriff back then called it electrical, even though the sky had been clear for weeks. By the late 1960s, the Buckners sold most of their land and disappeared. The ranch sat empty, falling to rot, its windows hollow, its barns sinking into dust. And now, under that same ground, Dorothy's car had been sleeping. Sheriff Rebecca interviewed what few locals still remembered the Buckners. One of them, Frank Dalton, now in his 80s, had been a ranch hand as a teenager. He spoke slow, pausing often, as if afraid the dirt itself might hear him. Miss Langston, yeah, she came out there once. I remember that car. Pretty blue thing, shiny as a new dime. Drove up to the house one afternoon, talking to Mr. Buckner himself. She didn't stay long, but he wasn't happy after she left. When Rebecca asked what he meant, Frank lowered his eyes. He said some things were better buried. That single line would haunt her for days, because buried, it seemed, was exactly what had happened. Not just to Dorothy, but to every truth tied to her. Still, the sheriff knew one thing. Dorothy's note had been written in fear, and whoever she was afraid of had money, power, and access to the Buckner Ranch. The team sent soil samples to the lab, hoping to match the time frame of the burial. The results were staggering. The layers surrounding the car dated between 1950 and 1953, placing the burial squarely within 3 years of her disappearance. But the surrounding soil was disturbed again in the 1970s. Decades later, someone had come back. Someone had checked on the grave. The news spread fast. Who buried Dorothy became a headline across Texas. Theories poured in. Some said she'd been pregnant. Others whispered she'd witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. But all Sheriff Rebecca knew for certain was this. Dorothy Langston didn't die by accident. She was silenced. And if the soil had been disturbed again 20 years later, then maybe, just maybe, the person who put her there hadn't done it alone. Next, forensic teams would begin searching the entire Buckner property, hundreds of acres of quiet land and rusted machinery. And what they'd uncover next would prove that Dorothy's car wasn't the only thing buried on that ranch. At dawn, the Buckner Ranch looked almost peaceful. Wide stretches of brittle grass shimmered in the early light, and the wind rolled softly through the dying mesquite trees. But beneath that stillness was something heavy, something that felt like the ground itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Rebecca Dugan stood at the fence line, staring across the land where Dorothy's car had been unearthed. 9 feet below her boots, the past had started to speak, and she was listening. For 75 years, people had called this place cursed. Cows went missing, farmhands quit without explanation, and strange lights were said to flicker in the empty barns long after midnight. Most folks stopped driving down the ranch road altogether. Now, with the discovery of Dorothy Langston's Ford Coupe, those old superstitions didn't seem so foolish anymore. The investigation team expanded the dig zone. Using ground-penetrating radar, they began mapping the property square by square. The results were unsettling. 4 separate anomalies were detected across the southern half of the ranch, each buried between 6 and 12 feet deep. The sheriff ordered a full excavation, and as the heavy machinery hummed and the dirt began to move, the secrets of the Buckner Ranch started to unravel. The first pit revealed rusted metal debris, old tools, buckets, and chain links tangled together. But the second contained something else. At just over 8 feet deep, workers uncovered a wooden crate, sealed with corroded nails. Inside were fragments of women's clothing, faded fabric with 1950s-style stitching, along with a pair of delicate white shoes. Forensic teams collected every scrap. It didn't take long for the news to spread. The sheriff might have found another victim. That night, as floodlights illuminated the dig site, the hum of machinery echoed across the open plains. Rebecca stood by the unearthed Ford Coupe, her flashlight beam sweeping across its cracked windshield. Inside, the faint smell of decay still lingered, mixed with oil and dust. Her deputy approached quietly. "Ma'am," he said, holding a tablet, "you might want to see this." He showed her the new scans. The third anomaly lay directly beneath what used to be the Buckner barn, now just a collapsed frame of timber. The soil around it was darker, denser, disturbed more than once. "Whoever buried that car," he said softly, "didn't stop there." The next morning, they began clearing the barn ruins. Under the rotting boards and nests of field mice, they found a trapdoor half hidden beneath rusted equipment. The wood was old but reinforced with metal hinges. When they pried it open, a rush of stale air escaped, the scent of rot oil, and something chemical. The ladder descended into a small underground room, maybe 10 feet wide, dug directly into the earth. There was a table, a single bulb hanging from a frayed wire, and along the wall, photographs, hundreds of them. Most were weathered, stained with moisture and time. But when they began to clean them carefully, faces emerged, women, men, workers, even children, all standing on the Buckner property in different decades. Many were smiling, but some looked frightened. One photo caught Rebecca's attention immediately. Dorothy Langston, standing beside her Ford Coupe, sunlight on her hair, her hand resting on the hood. Someone had written a date on the back, June 13th, 1950, the day before she vanished. It was clear now that Dorothy had been on that ranch willingly, at least once. But why? Old county property records revealed something no one expected. For a brief period in 1950, Dorothy's name appeared as a registered employee of the Wheeler Textile Mills Supply Distribution Branch, which delivered materials directly to the Buckner Ranch. She hadn't been just passing through that night. She was delivering something, and that meant someone on the ranch had known she was coming. The deeper investigators dug, the stranger the evidence became. Behind a false wall in the underground room, they found glass bottles, medical tools, and chemical containers labeled with half-erased markings: chloroform, ether, and formalin. The forensic team documented everything, their gloves brushing across the dust of half a century. Whoever had built that room had been meticulous, and it wasn't the work of a single rancher. Sheriff Rebecca began looking into Samuel Buckner's past, and what she found painted a darker portrait than anyone imagined. In 1948, Buckner had been briefly investigated for the disappearance of 2 farmhands, both migrants who'd last been seen on his property. The case was dismissed after lack of evidence. But buried in the old police records was a mention of Buckner's private doctor, Dr. Heller, the father of Tommy Heller, Dorothy's former boyfriend, the same Heller family who had quietly left town a year after Dorothy vanished. That connection between the ranch, the doctor, and Dorothy was too precise to ignore. Rebecca drove to Louisiana, where Tommy Heller had supposedly settled in the 1960s. She found his death certificate, dated 1974. Cause of death, accidental overdose. But something about it fell off. The witness who signed the certificate was listed as Samuel Buckner, Jr., the rancher's son, which meant the same family name had been present at both the disappearance and the cover-up. Back in Texas, forensic teams completed their excavation of the third anomaly. At a depth of 10 feet, they uncovered a metal barrel, sealed and welded shut. When they opened it, the stench was unbearable. Inside were human bones, partial, disjointed, and burned. At least 2 individuals, possibly more. DNA analysis would later confirm that neither set of remains belonged to Dorothy, meaning there were others. The town was shaken to its core. Local churches held vigils for the unknown souls of Buckner Ranch. People began to recall strange disappearances. Travelers who stopped for gas and never reached their next town. Workers who signed on for a season and were never seen again. For 70 years, everyone had called it coincidence. Now it looked like a pattern. And in the center of it all, Dorothy Langston's note: "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." That evening, as storm clouds gathered over plains, Sheriff Rebecca stood by the old barn's ruins, clutching a photo of Dorothy. She thought about Evelyn Langston, Dorothy's mother, who had died in 1985, still waiting for an answer. Now, after all these years, the truth was rising from the dirt. But the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had wanted the car found. The soil disturbance from the 1970 ES, the perfect alignment of the burial site, the way the note had survived intact after 75 years underground. Maybe it wasn't an accident that the construction crew dug exactly where they did. Maybe someone had known it was there and had waited until now to let it be found. And soon, investigators would discover something hidden inside Dorothy's car, something that would completely change their understanding of what happened that night in 1950, something that proved she wasn't alone when she died. For weeks, the Buckner Ranch became the epicenter of a ghost story turned investigation. State police, journalists, Even retired detectives from neighboring counties came to witness what many call the unearthing of history. The Ford Coupe, Dorothy's final resting place, had been moved to a secure forensic facility in Abilene. There, a team of crime scene analysts began the slow process of documenting every inch of it. 75 years of soil and time had sealed it tight, like a tomb. Sheriff Rebecca Dugan watched through the glass window as specialists in white suits carefully examined the vehicle under fluorescent lights. She had a gnawing feeling, the kind that doesn't fade with sleep. They'd found Dorothy, but something about the burial felt performed. Too deliberate, too careful. It was as if someone wanted her discovered. Eventually, the lab work began with the dashboard, and almost immediately, something strange surfaced. The instrument panel was wired shut from the inside, a crude modification, made with copper wire and tar-like residue. When they loosened it, a small envelope slid out from behind the gauge cluster, aged but intact. Inside was a strip of photonegatives. Most were blank, degraded by heat and moisture. But one image had survived, a faint, grainy photograph of a man's hand holding what looked like a badge. The lab enhanced it digitally. The badge was clear enough to read 2 words: Taylor County, the same sheriff's office that had investigated Dorothy's disappearance in 1950. Rebecca's stomach turned cold. If the man in that photo was a lawman, then Dorothy's warning note, "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident," might have been directed at one of her supposed protectors. The old case files showed that only 3 deputies worked the initial investigation: her grandfather, Charles Dugan, Deputy Lyle Cummings, and a third name barely visible under a coffee stain, Deputy Carl R. Holbrook. Holbrook. Rebecca recognized it immediately. The Holbrook family still lived in town, and Carl's son, Edward Holbrook, was now the city's mayor. When she visited the mayor's office 2 days later, Edward was polite but cautious. He denied knowing anything about the case. "I was a child when that happened," he said, his voice steady but tight. "My father never mentioned any girl, never mentioned the Buckner Ranch." But when Rebecca mentioned the buried Ford Coupe, the color drained from his face. He asked how deep it was buried. When she told him 9 feet, he looked down at his desk and whispered, "That's deeper than I thought." It was a slip, but it was enough. Rebecca filed for a warrant to re-examine Carl Holbrook's old property records. Meanwhile, forensic techs found something else inside the Ford Coupe: fingerprints. 2 distinct sets, both preserved by the heat and clay. One matched Dorothy's. The other didn't. When the results came back, the name on the report made Rebecca's pulse quicken. Thomas Heller, Dorothy's former boyfriend. The same man who supposedly left town right after she disappeared. But the timeline didn't fit. Dorothy's car had been buried years later, possibly as late as 1953, meaning someone had accessed her car long after she vanished. So, how did Heller's prints end up inside it? That night, Rebecca returned to the evidence vault. She laid out Dorothy's note, the photo negative, and the latest fingerprint analysis side by side. Something connected all 3. The photo of the badge, the fingerprints of the boyfriend, the burial on a ranch owned by a man tied to both the sheriff's office and a family doctor. It wasn't random. It was orchestrated. Dorothy hadn't just been silenced. She had been made an example, a warning for someone else. When investigators re-examined the Coupe's glove box, they found something hidden beneath the lining, a thin metal box, rusted shut. Inside were 3 small items: a broken wristwatch, a silver hairpin, and a folded telegram slip. The telegram read, "D. Langston, stop. Do not meet Heller at Buckner property. Stop. Tell no one. Stop. Too dangerous. Stop. R." There was no signature, no date, just the letter R. Rebecca's heart raced. Her own first initial, but it wasn't her. It had to be Ruth Meyer, Dorothy's cousin. Ruth was 92, but her mind was still sharp. When Rebecca returned to her home, she brought the telegram with her. Ruth's hands trembled as she read it. I tried to warn her," Ruth said softly. "She told me Tommy wanted to meet her out there. Said he'd gotten into something bad. He needed her help. But when I called the sheriff's office that night, they told me to stop asking questions." "Who told you that?" Rebecca asked. Ruth's voice lowered. "Deputy Holbrook. He said the Buckners were friends of the department, said it was a misunderstanding. Ruth wiped her eyes. After that, I never heard from her again. The puzzle was beginning to take shape. Dorothy had gone to the ranch to meet Tommy. He'd been working for the Buckners, likely forced into something criminal. But someone else knew about the meeting, possibly Deputy Holbrook, and followed her there. When things went wrong, they silenced her, then buried the evidence on Buckner's land, where no one would look. It explained everything, except for one detail. The soil around the car had been disturbed again in the 1970s. Someone had come back. But for what? Late one evening, a forensic tech named Elena Ortiz called Rebecca in a panic. They'd re-examined the coupe's passenger side floorboard and found a second note wedged under the seat springs. The handwriting was faint but legible. It wasn't Dorothy's. It read, "She's gone. They buried her car. I tried to stop them. I'm sorry. T.H. Thomas Heller." The ink had faded, but lab tests showed the writing dated to the early 1950s. If it was authentic, then Tommy had witnessed a burial, and maybe even helped under duress. That explained why he'd fled to Louisiana, why he'd overdosed in 1974, and why Samuel Buckner Jr., the rancher's son, had been listed as the witness on his death certificate. Buckner had been cleaning up loose ends. By the end of that week, the state reopened every missing person case from 1948 to 1955 connected to the Abilene area. 6 names appeared, all women, all presumed dead, all with one thing in common. They'd last been seen passing near the Buckner Ranch. Dorothy Langston's case wasn't just about one missing girl anymore. It was a key to a pattern. A network of men who thought they were untouchable, burying their sins in Texas dirt. When the forensics team finished their report, one final discovery was listed near the bottom of the file. It wasn't bones or artifacts. It was a single strand of barbed wire, found wrapped tightly around the coupe's rear axle. Testing showed traces of blood, human, female, but not Dorothy's. The Buckner Ranch was beginning to look less like a burial ground and more like a hunting field. And somewhere within that twisted legacy lay the truth of who killed Dorothy Langston, and why her car was buried so carefully beneath the Texas earth. The next clue would come from deep within the driver's side door, where a small compartment held a name that had been waiting 75 years to be read aloud. The Ford coupe sat under the sterile lights of the forensic bay like a ghost caught in steel. Every surface had been dusted, cataloged, and photographed. But even after weeks of examination, the car seemed to hold back, as if it still had more to say. Sheriff Rebecca Dugan leaned over the hood, her reflection trembling in the worn blue paint. She'd spent her entire life hearing stories about this car, her grandfather's obsession with the Langston case, her grandmother's whispers about the girl they never found. Now she stood before it, realizing this wasn't just a cold case. It was a wound, one that had been festering beneath her family's legacy for 3 generations. Forensic technicians began dismantling the driver's side door, looking for serial numbers, restoration markings, anything that might connect to Buckner's property records. But halfway through the process, one of the techs stopped. He'd found something strange, a false panel welded into the inner cavity of the door, a hidden compartment. When they pried it open, a small bundle fell out, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed tight against time. Inside were 3 items: a locket, a folded letter, and a small brass key. The locket was delicate, shaped like a heart, tarnished by years underground. Inside were 2 photographs, one of Dorothy, smiling faintly in her Sunday dress, and the other of Tommy Heller. It wasn't a surprise until they flipped it over. Scratched into the back, almost invisible under the grime, were 3 letters: CRH, Carl R. Holbrook. Rebecca felt a cold wave crawl down her spine. Why would Dorothy's locket bear the initials of the deputy who handled her disappearance? Had he given it to her, or had she taken it from him? The letter inside the same bundle only deepened the mystery. It was written in careful cursive, signed C. The ink had bled with moisture, but much of it was still legible. Dorothy, you shouldn't have come here tonight. They know about the papers, about Tommy. If you don't hand them over, they'll come for you too. Go home. Forget the ranch. Tell your mother you're safe. C. Rebecca stared at the page for a long time. The signature, C, could have been Carl, but the phrasing didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a warning. If Deputy Holbrook had tried to save Dorothy, then he hadn't been one of them. Maybe he'd discover what the Buckners and Heller were doing and try to stop it, but something went wrong. The brass key was the smallest piece, yet somehow the most haunting. Stamped faintly on one side were the words, Locker 6, Abilene Depot. Rebecca's mind raced. The Abilene Railway Depot had been decommissioned in 1971, then converted into a storage facility. Most of its lockers had been welded shut decades ago. She called the property manager, and within hours, she and her team were inside the old terminal, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Rows of lockers stretched out like forgotten tombs. Locker 6 sat near the end, covered in rust and graffiti. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a small wooden box, wrapped in newspaper dated 1950. The air that escaped smelled faintly of tobacco and motor oil. Within the box were dozens of ledger pages, handwritten lists of names, dates, and dollar amounts. Some entries were marked with a single word, delivered. Others said lost. The ledger's title page read, Buckner Ranch, Personnel and Shipments, 1948 to 1950. At the bottom, one more signature, S. Buckner/Dr. Heller/C.R. Holbrook. It was all there, the proof that the Buckner Ranch wasn't just a ranch. It had been a front, a cover for something darker, perhaps human trafficking or illegal medical experiments. The words delivered and lost weren't about cattle or supplies. They were about people. Dorothy must have discovered the ledger, maybe while working to the textile mill's delivery routes. She knew what they were doing, and they knew she knew. That's why she wrote the note. If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident. Rebecca called her deputy over. Get this box and logged, she said, her voice barely steady, and pull every death record linked to that time period. Every woman, every worker. I want names. The deputy nodded, but before he could walk away, Rebecca noticed something else inside the locker. Something taped to the back wall. A photograph, faded but clear enough to see. It showed Dorothy standing near her Ford Coupe, holding a stack of papers, the same ledger sheets, folded in her hands. Standing beside her was a man in uniform. Not Tommy, not Buckner. It was Deputy Holbrook. And in the corner of the photo, just barely visible, stood another figure. A man wearing a white doctor's coat. Dr. Heller. The implications were dizzying. Holbrook wasn't just a deputy. He'd been a double agent of sorts, caught between duty and fear. He'd tried to protect Dorothy, maybe even hide the evidence for her. But the others, Buckner and Heller, must have found out, so they silenced them both. Dorothy first, then Holbrook, and the ledger buried, lost, and locked away until someone dug deep enough, literally and figuratively, to uncover it again. Rebecca knew she couldn't stop now. She ordered her team to expand the search to include Holbrook's old residence, which had been untouched since his death in 1952. The house, just outside Abilene, had been empty for decades, a sagging structure swallowed by weeds. Inside, the walls still carried the faint smell of dust and oil. In his desk drawer, they found a half-finished letter addressed to the Texas Ranger Division. It read, I have reason to believe the Buckner operation extends beyond this county. I've gathered documents proving their involvement in disappearances tied to medical trials conducted under Dr. Heller's supervision. Miss Langston has evidence as well. If anything happens to me, the key is hidden where no one will find it, unless they find her first. The final line was smeared by water damage, but Rebecca could make out one word at the end. Forgive. It became clear then the brass key Dorothy had hidden wasn't just insurance. It was a message from Holbrook, meant for anyone who eventually uncovered her car. He'd known the truth would resurface one day. And the real horror wasn't that Dorothy had been murdered. It was that she and Holbrook had both tried to stop something far bigger and failed. The media called it Texas's buried secret. Historians began linking the Buckner Ranch to unsolved disappearances across the state during the late 1940s. people dismissed as runaways, drifters, or vagrants. Each new discovery led back to the same triangle of names: Buckner, Heller, Holbrook. But there was still one question no one could answer. What exactly were those medical trials Holbrook mentioned? And why had Dorothy, a textile worker, become tangled in them? The next clue would come not from paper, but from something buried beneath the coupe, a discovery that the dig team almost missed entirely. Because 9 feet below the Texas dirt, the Ford wasn't sitting on natural ground. It was sitting on a wooden platform, and beneath that platform was something far worse. The excavators had almost finished clearing the site when one of the workers shouted for the sheriff. The ground directly beneath the Ford coupe wasn't soil at all. It was with layered planks forming a kind of makeshift platform. Rebecca Dugan stepped down into the pit, flashlight trembling in her hand. The car had been placed here, not swallowed by accident or flood. Someone had taken the time to dig this pit, lower the coupe in, then seal it with timber before burying it completely. And beneath that platform, when they carefully pulled back the boards, they saw bones. Not just one set, several. At first, the forensics team thought they were animal remains, but the spacing of the ribs and jawlines told a different story. Human, 3 skeletons side by side, each wrapped in what looked like old burlap. Rebecca froze. The air was heavy with clay dust and something else, a stillness that seemed to hum with memory. One of the techs whispered, "Looks like 2 adults and a child." That changed everything. Dorothy's car wasn't just a grave. It was a marker. When they cataloged the bones and sent them for DNA testing, Rebecca's mind refused to rest. She replayed everything: the locket, the ledger, the letter from C, and the photograph of Holbrook standing beside Dorothy. But one detail kept gnawing at her: the glove box. In every report from the initial discovery, it was marked jammed shut. They'd avoided forcing it open for fear of damaging the evidence. Rebecca went back to the lab that night, alone, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing through the empty hall. The coupe sat under a tarp, as if sleeping. She peeled the tarp away, opened the driver's door, and reached for the glove box. The latch was rusted, but gave way with a sharp click. Inside, tucked neatly in an envelope sealed with wax, was a single folded page, and across the front, written in fading blue ink, were the words, "For whoever finds me." Rebecca's hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, careful, Dorothy Langston's. "If you are reading this, then you found my car. Please, don't think I ran away. I tried to tell them what they were doing here. The Buckner Ranch isn't what it seems. I saw them bringing people, women, children, off the train at night. They called them patients. But no one ever came back. Tommy tried to help me, but they caught him. They said I'd end up like the others if I talked. I'm going to meet Carl tonight. He says he has proof and a place we can hide it. If he doesn't come, it means they got him too. I'm leaving the papers in the car. In case I don't make it home, please tell my mama I wasn't crazy. Tell her I didn't just disappear. Dorothy." Rebecca read it twice, then pressed the paper to her chest. This wasn't a note written in panic. It was calm, deliberate, certain. Dorothy had known her fate. She hadn't just been murdered. She'd been erased. 2 days later, the DNA results came in. The first adult skeleton beneath the platform was confirmed to be Carl R. Holbrook. The second, a female in her early 20s, matched Dorothy Langston. The third, the smallest, a child estimated to be about 6 years old, had no immediate match in any missing person database. The discovery broke the case open again, because no one had ever reported a child missing connected to Dorothy. No one even knew she'd had one. The press swarmed the sheriff's office, demanding answers. Rebecca stood before them, face pale, voice steady. "We can now confirm that Dorothy Langston and Deputy Carl Holbrook were both buried at the site where her vehicle was found. The remains of a third, unidentified child were discovered with them. Investigation is ongoing." But after the cameras stopped rolling, Rebecca sat in her office, staring at the photo of Dorothy and Carl again. Behind them, faint but unmistakable, the outline of a small figure, a child, peeking from the back seat of the Ford coupe. Dorothy hadn't been alone that night. The new lead set Rebecca digging into birth records from the 1940s. There it was: Dorothy Mae Langston, mother of an unnamed female infant, born July 1944, father not listed. That meant Dorothy had a daughter. She would have been 6 years old in 1950, the same age as the skeleton found beneath the coupe. And there was one more detail. The hospital record listed the attending physician, Dr. Samuel Heller. Rebecca slammed the file shut. Everything pointed to him. Dorothy had gone back to Heller's ranch that night to expose him, maybe to threaten to go public, and Heller had silenced her. But why the child? Maybe Dorothy brought her daughter because she had nowhere else to leave her. Maybe Holbrook promised to protect them both. But something went wrong before they could escape. Rebecca visited the site again, this time at dusk. The wind brushed through the dry grass, whispering across the hole where the coupe had rested. She imagined the scene, the sound of the shovel, the dirt piling high, the night swallowing 3 lives whole. She knelt and whispered softly, "You were right, Dorothy. They didn't forget you." Then she turned to the lead investigator. "What about the third set of remains?" The man hesitated. "We found something with the child's bones," he said quietly. "A bracelet, silver, inscribed." Rebecca took the evidence bag from his hands. On the bracelet were 2 words, barely legible under corrosion. "For Annie." Rebecca's heart stopped. She flipped through Dorothy's old employment records. One letter, dated 1949, mentioned taking time off to care for Annie. The missing child had a name: Annie Langston, Dorothy's daughter. Back at the lab, Rebecca pored over Heller's medical files, searching for anything that tied him to the name. And buried deep in the archives, she found a registry of trial subjects from 1948, coded cryptic entries used to hide illegal experiments. Entry 49 to 7 read: Yale, female, age 4, bloodline match to patient DL. Highly responsive. Continue observation. Rebecca dropped the file, bile rising in her throat. Dr. Heller had used Dorothy's own daughter in his experiments. The truth was monstrous. Dorothy discovered what Heller was doing, testing on children, including her own. She tried to expose him, went to Holbrook for help, and the 2 planned to smuggle the evidence out of the ranch. But Heller and the Buckners found them before they could flee. He buried them all together, the mother, the child, and the man who tried to protect them. The car sealed above them, like a gravestone of guilt. Rebecca closed the file and whispered, "He buried his sins under her name." But one question still haunted her. If Dr. Heller was responsible, why had there been no trace of him after 1950? According to local records, he died in a fire at his own clinic in 1951. But something about that story had never felt right, because just a week ago, before the coupe was found, a letter arrived at the county archives, postmarked from Roswell, New Mexico. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed neatly, with no signature. It read, "Some ghosts don't stay buried forever. S.H." Rebecca stared at the initials. S.H. Samuel Heller. If he was still alive, that would make him well over 100. Impossible. But then again, nothing about this story had ever made sense. The deeper she looked, the more it felt like Dorothy's case wasn't about death at all. It was about what survived. And if the doctor who'd started all this was somehow still out there, then Dorothy Langston's story wasn't over. Not yet. Rain fell hard across the Texas plains that night, a rare storm, one that made the dust smell like ghosts. Sheriff Rebecca Dugan sat alone in her office, the letter from S.H. spread out on her desk. Some ghosts don't stay buried forever. She'd read it 100 times, tried to convince herself it was a hoax, some cruel prank mailed by someone who'd seen the case on the news. But the typewriter ink was old, the paper yellowed, the postmark dated months before Dorothy's car had been found. How could someone have known? Rebecca's phone buzzed. It was Dr. Hammond, the forensic pathologist assigned to the case. His voice was low, urgent. "Sheriff, you want to come down here? We've identified something in Holbrook's remains." When she arrived, Hammond led her to the examination table. The bones of Deputy Carl Holbrook lay arranged neatly, pale against the stainless steel. Hammond pointed to a fragment of metal fused to the ribs. It's a bullet. .32 caliber. Shot from close range. He paused. But here's the strange part. There's residue on it. Traces of an experimental sedative developed by the Army Medical Corps in the late 1940s. It was only tested in one facility right here in Texas. Rebecca frowned. Which facility? Buckner Ranch. That night, Rebecca drove out to the old ranch alone. The wind howled across the cracked earth, and lightning briefly illuminated the gutted barns. The place still smelled like decay, and something else, like chemicals. Inside one of the barns, she found a trapdoor half covered by hay. She pulled it open, her flashlight cutting through the dark. Stairs led down into a concrete corridor. It wasn't a cellar. It was a bunker. Old medical tables, rusted restraints, and empty vials littered the underground room. On the wall, faded paint still spelled the words, Heller Institute, Testing Bay 3. Rebecca's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a ranch. It was an illegal testing site, hidden in plain sight after World War II. In the far corner sat a steel filing cabinet. She forced it open and found what looked like patient logs from 1948 to 1950. Names, numbers, notes. Many marked deceased or lost. And there, near the bottom of one page, test subject, Aniel, transfer successful, relocated. Relocated? That single word changed everything. Rebecca froze. Could it be that Annie, Dorothy's daughter, hadn't died under the Coupe? The DNA match could have been wrong. Contamination, mislabeling, false correlation. If Annie had been taken, not killed, then someone had raised her, hidden her, and if that were true, she'd be in her 80s now. Rebecca ran her finger down the list. Next to Aniel was a note written in a different hand. Reassigned per Dr. Heller's instruction. Custody, W. Hanlon. The name sent a shock through her. Walter Hanlon, a government contractor tied to secret research facilities in New Mexico during the 1950s. Roswell, the same town the letter had been mailed from. It was no coincidence. Someone wanted her to find this. As she was leaving the bunker, her flashlight flickered and died. For a brief second, she thought she heard footsteps behind her. Slow, dragging, deliberate. But when she turned, there was nothing. Only the echo of rain hitting the old boards above. She got in her cruiser and sped back toward Abilene, the headlights slicing through sheets of rain. Her phone buzzed again, an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Sheriff Dugan? The voice was gravelly, old, strained. You don't know me, but I knew Dorothy. Rebecca's grip tightened on the wheel. Who is this? Name's Frank Carter. I work for the Buckners. You want the truth? You'd better come before the sun's up. Then the line went dead. Frank Carter lived in a crumbling trailer on the outskirts of Nolan County. When Rebecca arrived, the lights were off, but she saw him moving inside, a silhouette by the window. She knocked. After a moment, the door creaked open. The man who stood there looked like a relic of the past. White hair, hollow eyes, hands trembling from years of labor or guilt. He said softly, You're her blood, aren't you? Rebecca blinked. Whose blood? Rebecca Dugan. Dugan was your grandfather, right? He worked the Langston case back in 1950. He nodded, eyes glistening. I remember him. He came around the ranch, asking questions he shouldn't have. We all thought he'd get himself killed. Rebecca stepped inside. The place reeked of cigarettes and rust. Frank poured 2 cups of coffee with shaking hands and said, You found her car, didn't you? She nodded. I helped bury it, he said quietly. The words hit her like a hammer. I didn't have a choice, he continued. They had guns, and they said if we didn't do it, we'd be next. We lowered the car in by crane, covered with boards, and they made us swear never to speak. I thought about that night every day for 75 years. Rebecca's throat went dry. Who made you? Dr. Heller, he whispered, and that bastard Buckner. But it was Heller who ran the show. He said she'd seen too much, said she stole his research. But there was more, something he was terrified of. Frank reached for an old shoebox under his bed and handed her a bundle of letters, bound with frayed ribbon. "They're hers," he said. "Dorothy used to write me. She was kind, always asked about my wife. She said she'd seen something in the basement lab. Something alive that shouldn't have been." Rebecca's skin prickled. "Alive?" Frank nodded slowly. "She said they were testing on kids, mixing blood types, doing transfusions to make resistant subjects. They said it was for polio research. But I saw what came out of that basement, Sheriff. It wasn't medicine." He swallowed hard, eyes glassy. "One of the kids, a little girl, she didn't scream when they cut her, just stared, calm as stone. Heller said she was different. He said her blood was special." Rebecca whispered, "Annie." Frank nodded faintly. "That was her name." "She didn't die, Sheriff. Heller took her with him when he left Texas. Said she was the key to finishing his work." Rebecca sat there in stunned silence. "You mean she's alive?" He looked at her, eyes wet. "She was. Last I heard, she went missing again in the 1970s, out near New Mexico. Heller called her his daughter." Rebecca's hand shook. If Annie had lived, she would be around 80 now, possibly still alive, possibly the one who sent that letter. Or maybe it had been him. Frank leaned forward. "I kept one thing, Sheriff. Something Heller left behind." He pulled out a small glass vial from the shoebox, sealed tight, filled with a faint red liquid. "I found it the day after he left the ranch. Label says sample AL." Rebecca's pulse quickened. Annie Langston's blood. Before she could ask another question, a sound cut through the silence. Tires on gravel. Frank's eyes widened. "Get down," he hissed. A black car idled outside, headlights off. Then a gunshot. Rebecca hit the floor as glass shattered around her. Frank collapsed beside her, clutching his chest, blood soaking through his shirt. She crawled toward him, pressing her hands over the wound. "Stay with me, Frank." He gripped her wrist weakly. "Find her," he gasped. "Find Annie." Then his eyes went still. Outside, the black car peeled away into the rain. When the police arrived, they found no license plate, no tire prints, no trace of the shooter. The vial was gone. Rebecca stood in the doorway as dawn broke, pale light spreading across the soaked earth. Dorothy's car had been buried for 75 years. But the truth was still being buried, one witness at a time. And somewhere out there, whether alive or a ghost, the name Annie Langston lingered. The only person left who truly knew what Dr. Heller had done. The rain had stopped by morning, but the world still felt soaked in death. Frank Carter's trailer sat surrounded by squad cars, the sheriff's team combing every inch for evidence that wasn't there. No footprints, no shell casings, just a scent of gunpowder and the faint trace of oil from tires that had rolled through mud and vanished. Sheriff Rebecca Dugan stood beside the body bag as it was zipped up. Frank's final words echoed in her mind like a curse. "Find her, find Annie." She turned toward the horizon. The storm clouds were lifting, revealing the same Texas sun that had witnessed Dorothy Langston's last breath 75 years ago. And Rebecca knew then, whatever this was, it wasn't over. At the station, Rebecca laid out every piece of evidence they had. Photographs, letters, the ledger from the locker, Dorothy's final note, the bunker files, a timeline of horror spread across her desk. Each document, each artifact pointed to one name, Dr. Samuel Heller. Officially dead in 1951. Unofficially, no one ever found his body. And now, with that letter postmarked from Roswell, Rebecca was starting to think maybe they never would. She called the state archives and requested sealed military and medical records from the late 1940s. Most of the files were still redacted, but one caught her eye. Project Echo, Experimental Cellular Hematology Operations. It was marked declassified, 1989. The summary read, "Private contract conducted under Drive S. Heller, 1947 to 1950. Objective, develop cellular regeneration via modified transfusion in pediatric subjects. Outcome, inconclusive. Facility closed following contamination event. Remaining assets relocated. Remaining assets. Rebecca felt her stomach turn. They weren't talking about machines. They meant children. She dug deeper. The more she searched, the clearer it became. Heller hadn't been working alone. Project Echo was funded through Buckner Agricultural Holdings, a fake name masking a military grant funneled through local ranches. Dorothy had stumbled upon those records while working at the textile mill, which had contracts with Buckner's supply lines. She hadn't been a random victim. She had discovered their cover, and when she tried to expose it, she paid with her life. Rebecca drove back to the old Buckner ranch at sunset, flashlight in hand. The land was quiet now, the dig site fenced off, the air heavy with the weight of history. She stopped at the crater where the Coupe had been buried and just stood there. The soil beneath her feet had seen too much. She whispered softly, "Dorothy, I'm trying." Then her light caught something glinting in the dirt, a metal tag, half buried near the edge of the pit. She brushed off the mud, stamped on it with the words, Heller Institute, Specimen 49A.L. Her breath caught. The same designation from the medical files. Annie Langston. Rebecca called her tech team immediately. They swept the area with metal detectors, and within an hour, unearthed a small lead box no larger than a lunch pail. Inside were rolls of decayed film reels, sealed in plastic. When processed, the footage was silent and grainy black and white. Filmed sometime in 1949. At first, it showed nothing unusual. Doctors in lab coats, children seated in rows, nurses recording notes. But as the frames flickered on, Rebecca felt her chest tighten. One of the children looked directly at the camera, a small girl with dark curls and pale, steady eyes. Dorothy Langston's eyes. The film showed the girl being led into a chamber filled with medical equipment. A man, Dr. Heller, entered the frame, gesturing to a clipboard. He smiled at the child. Then the footage cut abruptly, replaced by a second reel labeled Phase 2. Rebecca hesitated before playing it. The images that followed made her skin crawl. The girl, Annie, lay on a table, tubes running from her arms. A nurse drew vials of her blood, while another injected a clear liquid. Dorothy stood nearby, restrained, screaming soundlessly through the silent film. Heller turned to the camera, lifted a syringe, and mouthed a phrase. When the technicians enhanced the image later, they realized what he'd said. Perfection through blood. Rebecca shut off the projector, hands trembling. Her voice was hoarse when she whispered. He experimented on them on her. It explained everything. The ledger entries marked delivered. Those weren't workers. They were test subjects. But one question still lingered. If Annie had survived, what had she become? That night, Rebecca sat in her car outside the precinct, staring at the Roswell letter again. Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. She answered, bracing for another ghost. But the voice that came through was soft. "You're looking for me." Rebecca froze. "Who is this?" "You already know." The line crackled. A pause. "My mother's name was Dorothy." Rebecca's heart pounded. "Annie." The voice wavered, old, fragile, but unmistakably human. "I've been hiding my whole life. They said I was sick, that I was special. But I saw what he did. I saw him kill her." Rebecca whispered, "Where are you?" "Roswell. There's something you need to see, but you have to come alone." Then the line went dead. By morning, Rebecca was already on the highway, the horizon stretching wide and empty. Mile by mile, the world around her grew barren. Oil fields giving way to red desert, the kind of place where secrets outlast the people who buried them. Roswell wasn't a city. It was a scar pretending to be one. The address Annie gave led to a crumbling adobe house on the edge of town. The front door was open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old paper. Stacks of letters and photos covered every surface. Newspaper clippings about Texas missing girl. Medical records, photos of Dorothy. And then Rebecca saw her. Annie Langston stood by the window, 80 years old, but still carrying the same calm stare from the footage. Her eyes were pale gray, almost translucent, like glass. "I thought I was the only one left," she said softly. Rebecca took a cautious step forward. "I've been looking for you for months." Annie nodded. "You're Dugan's granddaughter. Your grandfather tried to help my mother." Rebecca swallowed hard. "Annie, what happened after she died?" Annie looked away. "He told me she was asleep. He told me I was chosen. For years, he kept me locked away. Doctors, nurses, needles every week. I stopped bleeding. I stopped aging." Rebecca stared at her. "You mean—" "I don't get sick. My blood heals." Annie walked to a small table and picked up a vial filled with the same faint red liquid Frank Carter had described. He called it the cure. But it was a curse. She held it out. "You see this? He took everything from my mother to make this. And now others want it too. They've been following me for decades." Rebecca hesitated. "Who?" Annie's eyes darkened. "The same people who buried her. The ones who paid Heller." Before Rebecca could speak again, headlights swept across the room. A car had stopped outside. Annie's expression hardened. "They found me." Rebecca drew her weapon, moving toward the door. "Stay behind me." But when she stepped outside, the desert was empty, just wind and dust swirling under the moonlight. Then a voice came from the dark. Male, smooth, ancient. "Sheriff Dugan, you've done well." Rebecca's stomach turned. She recognized the voice. She'd heard it once before, from the tapes recovered in the bunker. It was him, Dr. Samuel Heller. A silhouette stepped forward, face hidden beneath a wide hat. The impossible had shape, an old man, frail, but standing tall. His eyes were the same as in the footage, cold and calculating. "You can't be alive," Rebecca whispered. He smiled faintly. "Oh, Sheriff, you underestimate the science your government was so eager to bury." He glanced toward the house. "Annie, you still have what belongs to me." Annie's voice shook. "You stole my mother's life." "And gave you eternity," he hissed. Rebecca raised her gun. "Step back." But Heller didn't flinch. He simply smiled, a patient, chilling smile. "You can't kill what doesn't die." The wind howled across the desert, carrying the weight of 75 years of silence. And for the first time since Dorothy Langston vanished, all the pieces of truth stood together in the same place. The daughter who lived, the man who refused to die, and the sheriff bound by blood to uncover it all. The past wasn't buried anymore. It was alive, and it was about to fight back. The desert went dead silent. For a moment, all Sheriff Rebecca Dugan could hear was the rattle of the wind against the empty house. Dr. Samuel Heller stood in the dust, framed by the pale light of the moon, a man who, by all logic, shouldn't exist. Annie Langston was trembling behind her, clutching the vial in her hands like it was the last piece of her mother she had left. Rebecca's gun didn't waver, but her heartbeat did. "Step away from her," she said, her voice steady but low. Heller tilted his head. His eyes were ghost pale, and his skin carried that strange, waxy smoothness, the kind of skin that didn't belong to an 80-year-old man. "You think you understand," he said quietly. "You don't. What your kind called monstrous was genius. Your government begged me to continue. They hid what I created." He took another step forward, his boots crunching over the sand, and he whispered, "Don't listen to him." Heller smiled faintly. "I gave her a gift. The blood you fear is the same blood that could cure the world." Rebecca's finger tightened on the trigger. Cured the world by killing children? Heller's grin faded. They were chosen. They had something in their cells that the rest of us lacked. A dormant code. Dorothy Langston carried it. She didn't even know. He glanced toward Annie. And when her daughter was born, she became the vessel. The perfect copy. The future. Rebecca took a slow breath. "You killed her mother." Heller's expression hardened. "She refused to help me finish the serum. She destroyed my notes, tried to run. I couldn't allow that. Her death was necessary." Annie's eyes filled with tears. "You buried her like an animal." "I preserved her," Heller said coldly. 9 feet underground. Safe from the scavengers. Safe from decay. She was my foundation. Rebecca fired. The shot cracked through the night, echoing across the open desert. Heller staggered backward, his chest jerking, then straightened again, the bullet hole sealed before Rebecca's eyes. He exhaled sharply, as though mildly inconvenienced. "Now you see," he said softly. "The serum works." Rebecca's hand trembled. She'd seen men shot before, but never one who didn't bleed. Heller's eyes glowed faintly, almost phosphorescent under the moonlight. "I survived what your grandfather tried to do to me," he said. "I've survived every attempt since. I don't age. I don't die, but I do remember." He smiled again, and it was a terrible thing, too calm, too knowing. "And I remember your bloodline, Sheriff Dugan. You're not here by chance." He helped hide the first bodies. "The Langston girl was just one of many." Rebecca's voice caught. "You're lying." He tilted his head. "Then why do you think your family's been guarding this land for generations?" Behind her, Annie whispered, "He's twisting you. That's what he does." Rebecca blinked hard, shaking herself out of the fog Heller's words created. She stepped closer to Annie. "We end this tonight." Annie nodded, then held up the vial. "He needs this. It's what keeps him alive." Heller's tone turned sharp. "Annie, don't." Rebecca's eyes darted between them. "What's in it?" "Her blood," Annie said quietly. "My mother's." Rebecca's stomach turned. Heller took another step, his patience cracking. "Give it to me, child. You were never meant to feel the weight of it, only to carry it." Annie met his eyes. "You'll never have it again." She crushed the vial in her fist. The glass shattered, blood seeping into the dirt. Heller roared, a raw, guttural sound that didn't sound human. His face twisted, veins darkening, his body shuddering like it was collapsing under invisible pressure. Rebecca grabbed Annie and pulled her back toward the house. "Move!" They ran inside as the air outside seemed to vibrate. The windows rattled. The floorboards groaned. Rebecca spun toward the kitchen and spotted an old gas lantern on the counter. She snatched it up, her mind racing. Outside, Heller was stumbling toward them, his voice echoing, distorted and broken. "You think you've won? You can't erase me." Rebecca's voice was cold. "We're not trying to erase you." She lit the lantern, hurled it toward the floor, and the room ignited. Flames tore through the drywood like paper, roaring to life. The old ranch house became a furnace of heat and light, swallowing the darkness whole. Rebecca grabbed Annie's arm. "Go, go, go." They burst out through the back door, coughing through the smoke. Behind them, Heller stumbled into the fire. His coat caught first, then his hands, his face, his body. He didn't scream. He just stared at Rebecca through the flames, unblinking. For the first time, he looked mortal, and as his body collapsed into ash, the desert wind carried his final words. "It's not over. The blood remembers." Hours later, the sky began to lighten. The house was gone, burned down to its foundation. Sheriff Rebecca Dugan stood beside Annie on the ridge, watching the smoke curl into the dawn. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Annie said quietly, "He's really gone?" Rebecca exhaled. "I don't know, but what matters is that you're not." Annie looked down at her hands. The faint cut from the broken vial already gone, healed without a trace. "I don't want this," she said. "I just wanted my mother back." Rebecca's eyes softened. Maybe now she can rest. 2 weeks later, Rebecca filed her final report. Officially, the case of Dorothy Langston was closed. Death by unknown causes. Body recovered. But off the record, the truth lived on paper no one would ever read. She had the film reel sealed in evidence, the remains of the vial destroyed. But one small item stayed with her, the metal tag found in the dirt. Heller Institute, Specimen 49 A.L. She kept it on her desk, not as a trophy, but as a warning. One night, as she worked late at the station, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered, "Sheriff Dugan." A pause, then a voice low and soft. "He's not gone." Rebecca froze. "Who is this?" The voice was faint, almost trembling. "They're still looking for me. I can't stay here." It was Annie. Rebecca stood from her chair. "Where are you?" "I don't know anymore. But if something happens to me, static swallowed her words. Then the blood remembers. The call went dead. Months passed. The land where the Buckner Ranch once stood was sold to a development company. They cleared the debris, poured new foundations, and raised a row of steel-framed houses under a bright Texas sky. No one ever mentioned Dorothy Langston again. No one talked about the fire. But sometimes when the workers dug too deep, they said the soil bled. Dark stains that never dried, and a faint hum like a heartbeat beneath the earth. And maybe that's how it ends. Not with answers, but with echoes. Because every ghost leaves a trail. Every secret leaves blood. And somewhere, out there in the endless Texas desert, a woman who hasn't aged a day since 1950 walks beneath the stars. Her eyes the same color as her mother's. She carries what's left of Dorothy Langston. And deep in her veins, the truth still beats. Softly, endlessly, waiting to be found again.